So this episode, I'm going to be using a clip from and a story from a Cam Newton interview, and so I wanted to emulate Cam Newton's eclectic style, as he spells it, NCLETA. We'll get into that in this episode, but I wanted to showcase because I also consider myself a fashion-forward man. I don't know if I would necessarily throw this outfit on, but this works. This is my version of it. I'm not as eclectic as Cam Newton is, but this is a nod to the man, and so you know, hope you like the shoes and everything and how it fits. But let's jump into the story. How to instantly improve your articulation and confidence. About a month ago, sometime in January, Cam Newton dropped a podcast with rapper Lady London. Hadn't really known Lady London, still don't really know her music, but I thought she was a very intelligent lady, and she's an alum of Howard. I went to Howard Law. My daughter goes to Howard right now. She's a sophomore. And clearly, during that interview, Lady London was the more well-spoken of the two, right? It was a funny episode at least two different occasions. Cam described himself as eclectic. It looked like he was trying to say the word eclectic, but he said eclectic twice. And on the second time that he used the word, Lady London corrected him. He said, "I think you mean eclectic." And so when that happened, instead of, taking the correction, Cam, decided to double down. He did what I describe as what, that one kid does when he falls and then pretends he did it on purpose, start doing push-ups or the worm. And for me, I thought that Cam handled that well personally, because it was clear to me that, he admired Lady London's intellect and her education. He talked about it multiple times as her being different than the crowd of rappers that are out there. And to me, he seemed like he actually really appreciated that, and he appreciated her intelligence. But a lot of people saw it differently, and I think they saw it differently because their own experience with men who are troubled by, what they assume is an aggressive woman. I didn't see that there in the episode. I felt like there was appropriate banter there, and I felt like Lady London did a great job of being gracious during that interview, despite the fact that she clearly was more articulate. And I think she understood that Cam was not to be put in a box. He was and is, in fact, eclectic, not only in his life, in his wardrobe, but also in the way that he thinks and presents himself. And that's what I got from it. A lot of people felt differently, and in fact, he was taken down because it was funny. At one point he described eclectic, still doing that worm thing after falling down. He described eclectic, or not described, he spelled the word, because she asked him, okay, spell the word that you mean to say, and he spelled it as NCLETA. Again, from my perspective, that was funny, but I digress, because my true purpose in using that example is to talk to you about how it is that you can navigate a conversation when you are not the most skilled or the most articulate person in the room. And this is what we're here to talk about. Why articulation signals confidence and competence. All right, so first, let me start out by outlining what happens, what social psychologists realize happens when people meet with one another. One of the things that we do is we try to come off as competent, or it's the two things that we try to get from people is warmth or competence. And we want people to be warm towards us because, obviously it means they're not a threat to us. And then we want to signal competence because it is a signal of our own self-worth. So this is how we generally operate. So now one of the fastest ways that you're going to be able to, signal that you're competent is the way you articulate yourself, whether or not you truly know anything. But communication is important. The way that you communicate something is going to determine whether you get support from other people. And that support is going to be necessary in any endeavor that you aim at if it's going to be a meaningful one. You can't do it alone. So for that reason, we should be able to agree that articulation matters. And because it matters, teaching our children and ourselves how to articulate more effectively should be a paramount goal, especially as we aim to exercise what I call relational power. For men, this understanding is important, especially in the Black community, but everywhere, because women have been running circles around us in, discussions with differing opinions for quite some time. And, they do this because women prioritize relational skills. And as a result, they spend a lot more time honing their ability to articulate than we do. The understanding about being articulate. When people think about what it means to be articulate, what we do is we tend to overemphasize vocabulary and linguistic precision. And it's not to say that vocabulary and linguistic precision is not important, because they are. The better you can communicate yourself, the better it is that you can get your point across. And we should all seek to be lifelong learners of how to better and more effectively convey our thoughts. Now, the way that we do this, though, often comes down to not exactly, getting great vocabulary, but how we frame our point of view. And this is why sometimes you'll see people who are confident and persuasive more than others, because they know how to frame their ideas very well. So this is what we're going to talk about next. Frame your message by adding context. Getting your point across is about framing. It is more about framing than word choice. Framing is how you position the point you're making, and at its core, framing is about adding context. All right. So context gives your position color, it gives it meaning, it gives it clarity. And to do that effectively, you have to put yourself in the shoes of your audience. You have to ask yourself, what am I assuming they know because I know it? I'm taking it for granted. You have to say to yourself, for example, if I was lost in the jungle somewhere and I had to tell someone how to get to me, what would I have to know? What would I have to look at and consider so that they can get there? All right. And so depending on what you're trying to do and what you think is best, you should add your context before making your point, during the time you're making your point, or right after making your point. So another way to think about adding context is to think about it as painting a picture. You have to describe enough of the scene that the listener ends up in the same mental space that you're in. Great storytellers do this very well. Dave Chappelle is a perfect example of somebody that does this well. When he tells his jokes, his stories don't land because he uses big words. They land because he makes sure that you see what he sees before he delivers his punchline. Framing is also about how you position yourself. When you speak, you can position yourself as an expert, a peer, a learner, or a victim. It all depends on what response you're looking for from the audience. And so one mistake people who lack confidence do is they pretend to know something that they don't know. They believe that, that performance will convey to the others competence. But then a lot of times that backfires. Instead of earning respect or assistance from someone, you can lose credibility and sympathy. A better approach then is to position yourself as a confident and eager novice. That means admitting you don't know while you're also signaling your willingness and capacity to learn. That step alone and dramatically shift how others respond to you. Slow down when you feel intimidated. Adding context requires that you slow down. When you feel intimidated, time can feel distorted. You may feel like you're talking too much or you're taking too long, even though it's only milliseconds that are going by. So slowing down enough to think about what context your audience needs will almost always improve your message and how it lands. One practical way to ensure this happens is to plan your framing before it is your turn to speak. And yes, I know, when you're intimidated, your heart's going to race, your palms are going to sweat. There's almost no way around that. But even in that moment, as you hear your heart beat in your ears and you feel the weight of everyone's attention on you, remind yourself, relax, chill out, slow down. Once you make your point, the anxiety will fade and relief will come quickly. And it is worth the pause. The first step then to better articulation is to frame your message by adding context. Come to learn, not to perform. The second step happens before you even enter the room. Because competence is tied to how we speak, many of us unconsciously identify with our positions. Our worth becomes associated with our performance. When that happens, every conversation feels like a test. When you come to learn instead of performing, the pressure can evaporate. Your value is no longer on the line, so you can feel free to just be yourself. Coming to learn also forces you to truly listen. It's only when you genuinely understand the other person's position that you can respond intelligently and with better context. This becomes especially important when engaging with someone who is aggressive or intimidating. The first thing I want you to understand in that case is that it's okay. And in fact, I encourage you to admire and appreciate the way the other person speaks. Acknowledging this, that you admire how they speak, is how you can begin to pay attention enough to learn from them. Now, once you've done that, and it's your turn to respond, do not let your admiration for the person's manner of speaking make you adopt their framework for speaking. Now, trying to emulate their speech is not something that's going to happen mid-conversation. This is a long-term project. So, speak how you speak. More importantly, when you start to admire or be intimidated by someone's delivery, it can cause you to overestimate the soundness of their argument. If that happens, you may even start to believe that the audience, even if that audience is just you, believes that you're losing the debate. And that often is untrue. If you have a solid point, people are capable of recognizing the point. In fact, there are many situations where someone is less articulate and they are able to sway the room simply because the audience agrees with their underlying position. So rather than becoming intimidated, relax, calmly evaluate what's being said, and look for false assumptions or logical leaps in the other person's argument. Those are often the most effective places to respond. Ensure mutual understanding before debating. Next, determine whether you actually understand one another. To do this, you must, once again, add context. Specifically, you will add context by explaining how you arrived at your conclusion. Okay, so this is where I am. This is how I'm guiding you to how to get to where I am. Now, sometimes the other person is going to grow impatient. And they believe they already know your reasoning. They've had this argument so many times, they feel like they know what's coming. And more importantly for them, they're eager to get you to that moment when you can see. And you know what? They may be right. But that shouldn't stop you. Add your context anyways. Because maybe they have heard your point before, but sometimes it is the case that they haven't heard what you said yet. And rushing you along risks something that you both need, a key distinction that may lead to what these conversations should be about in the first place. And that is getting to genuine understanding. So add the context. Now, When you are doing that with an impatient person, you're going to be interrupted. And when that happens, it could throw you off. So when that happens, a calm response like, bro, I get it. Your mind's moving quickly. But if you give me a moment, you might see exactly how you can bring me to your side. Now that works beautifully. Why? Because it calls out the interruption without being hostile. And so it makes the other person more receptive to listening and hearing you out. Now, when you notice that you're both repeating yourselves, then you can safely assume that understanding is there. At that point, you stop adding context, whether it's early or not, in the conversation, and then you can start to address the real point of disagreement. Trust yourself enough to speak boldly. Okay, so finally, what you need to do is to trust yourself. Trust yourself enough to make that bold or provocative statement that you believe. This is usually the part that you have rehearsed multiple times, even if it's subconscious, which is why you will better be able to articulate it. You may be wrong, or your opinion may be politically incorrect, but you will recover so long as you don't retreat. Cancel culture only works if you cancel yourself. Besides, if a group cannot tolerate thoughtful disagreement, then maybe that group is not worth your censoring yourself to be a part of it. Of course, what I'm saying right now means that I believe that you can distinguish between what is indecent and what is merely controversial. I don't know whether or not you can, because the truth is that it's becoming harder and harder in these years of outrage culture. But when you trust yourself in this way, something subtle and very, very important will happen. You begin to feel at home in conversations. You start to recognize the unique value that you bring to each interaction, because no one else sees the world exactly as you do. That sense of comfort and ownership will dramatically increase your articulation, not because you suddenly know more words, but because you are no longer afraid to use the ones you already have. Thank you. Next week, I will be addressing one of the biggest things that causes us to not change for the better. And it will surprise you what that is. So I encourage you to tune in to next week as I talk about the thing that is holding you back from becoming your new you. Talk soon. Bye.